Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Interloops YouTube channel. And today we are speaking to the lovely, amazing, the purple-haired, very on brand Elizabeth Deanna Morris Lakes in reference to her new book, Ashley Sugarnotch and The Wolf. All the details of which for purchase will be found in our bio, and more information of which you can find on our website, our Instagram, and our Twitter, and our Facebook, and our everything. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk to you about today, I feel like you must get this all the time, but I must ask about your name being a line of iambic pentameter.
Oh yes, this is my greatest accomplishment.
The most amazing author origin story that perhaps I've ever encountered.
So when I was a freshman in undergrad, so I went to Susquehanna University for creative writing. I took a class called forms of poetry, I guess it was called. And I think that I knew what iambic pentameter was before then, but we got to the part on meter and we were talking about iambic pentameter. And I remember being like, my name's really long, and like counting it out and going like Eliz, Beth, D, Ann, Moore, Is. And I was like, oh, well, one, that's weird that my name doesn't end on a hard, like on an emphasized syllable. But two, I just need to marry somebody with a one syllable last name and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
And then I started dating my husband about a year later. And when I started dating Kenny, I was like, oh, this could happen. And then like 6 months later, I was like, this is happening.
He fits my prerequisites.
Yeah. I was like, this is happening. I'm not hyphenating, which is a whole issue. I wouldn't wish this name on anybody. Like my kid doesn't have Morris Lakes. He just says Lakes because why would I do that to a child? Give him a 2-word unhyphenated last name. But yeah, it's, I'm really dedicated. The irony being that I never write in iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is like very difficult to write and successfully.
Yeah.
But
so this is completely unintentional. I was thinking maybe your parents were huge archaeologists.
No, wow. My first name is my mother's middle name. So she's Margaret Elizabeth. And then my middle name, Deanna, is that my cousin, so my uncle got divorced and remarried a woman who already had a daughter, and her name was Deanna, and he officially adopted her. And so as a way to welcome her into the family, I became Elizabeth Deanna. And then and I don't even talk to this, seems to be very lovely woman. I have not seen her in like 15 years or something like that. But yeah, I'm named after her. I'm named after her and my mom.
Oh my goodness. So it's just complete fate of the universe that it happens to be like beautifully metric. Oh, incredible.
Yeah. So you snatch those opportunities when they come.
You do. My last name is Wolf, and I have thought my whole life about if I ever take someone else's last name, it needs to be better than that. And that has been really difficult.
That's the other thing too, is like Morris is such a like boring last name. It just means like, it actually means dark skinned because of like the Moors. And everybody has it. And it's silly. Lakes is a really unique last name. Lake is very common, but Lakes is not. And so I was just like, yeah, clearly Lakes is going to be part of my last name. It's better and it'll make me more
it's an upgrade. Yeah, we're moving up.
Yeah, which is also why Elliot ended up with Lakes, because I'm not going to give him just Morris. That's boring. It's boring. No offense to my ancestors, but
okay, amazing. So yes, I would love to talk next about Ashley Sugarnotch and The Wolf, which I have had the honor and pleasure of hearing you read from multiple times now at multiple interlude events. So last night at our May event, you described Ashley Sugarnotch and The Wolf as being about cycles of violence, something that feels really raw and painful and really specifically rendered in that first section, and then opens up to include other women after the coda. So I was thinking, how did Ashley, for you, come together as the representative female figure of these cycles? And how did you choose to expand that perspective at the end of the text?
So Ashley started because I was driving to see Kenny when we started dating, and there's a sign, an exit sign on 81 North, that's the Ashley Sugarnotch exit. And I said,
oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah. And I said, oh, that sounds like the name of someone. I'm going to write about Ashley Sugarnotch. And then I was like trying to figure it out. I just sort of kept this in my pocket. And maybe like a year and a half later, I was in the gallery at Susquehanna where they were doing a portrait competition. And there was this painting. It's called Red Bow by Bob Divin.
Yes.
And I was like, that's Ashley Sugarnotch. And the painting, it's this huge painting. If somebody wants to buy it for me, it's like $5,000, and you know, they can donate that and I'll hang it on my
Link
wall.
in the description to Liz's address. Just send it on over.
Send it to me. It's fine. I'm sure he would love for me to have it if somebody were to pay for it. And it's this woman standing, flipping the bird, wearing green bikini bottoms and this big red bow over her chest, which is where the first poem, Ashley Sugarnotch and the Big Red Bow, comes from. And I was like, that's Ashley Sugarnotch. And I knew a couple of things about Ashley. I was like, I remember thinking to myself, okay, am I allowed to swear?
That is a great question. I want to say yes.
Okay.
Worst case, I'll bleep it.
I was like, Ashley Sugarnotch is a bitch, is what I kept thinking to myself. And I wanted her to be unlikable. I always knew that she was unlikable. And so from there, I started writing these poems about her being this sort of woman that is really unlikable, and at least initially, and clearly has a lot of privilege is the other thing. That's part of what makes her unlikable, is she, I really wanted that first poem with her where she's talking about how she wishes her body were marred, to come off as sounding just obnoxious. Because she has all of this trauma, and yet she has all of this privilege because she's white, she's pretty, she's conventionally beautiful, and she is unmarred, right? She looks normal, quote unquote. And so I started writing these poems about her, and then as I kept writing, the wolf showed up. And the wolf, I think initially, I've said this before, I think the wolf initially was me, like Liz.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Because some of the poems, like the poem, like The Wolf Always Dreams, those are all real dreams that I've had, which I feel very sneaky that I snuck them into the book. And then from there, it just became like this development. So there's a poem in the coda, the poem called Trisha. And Trisha is about somebody that I went to elementary school and junior high with, who was murdered. And I wasn't super, super close with her, but I was still friends with her on Facebook, and hearing her story, where I knew that she had been pregnant and had this kid. And then I knew that she was pregnant again, and her first daughter's father shot her in the stomach and dragged her body up to his apartment. She had a restraining order against him. So there's like, it's not really clear why she even went over there. And it's also very clear what his intentions were because of where he shot her. And then I just kept seeing the story over and over again. So I don't know if you remember the Facebook murder, but there was something called like the Facebook murder, where this dude in Florida, I think it was in Florida, shot his wife and then posted a picture of her body on Facebook, which you can still find on the internet. And they had a 12-year-old daughter, and she was just upstairs. And then even like last night at the reading, the one person who, I feel bad that I don't remember her name right now, she told a story in one of her poems about a girl that she grew up with, whose father did the same thing. And that's where I started to think about like these cycles where you have these two creators, right? These two parents that are creators, and you are yet orphaned because one commits violence against the other. And how are you supposed to break out of that? And then through the myth and the fairy tale part of it, I started to look at it through the lens of fairy tales and folk tales, because those stories, there's so many versions of them. So like if you go and look at different versions of the Little Red story, Ashley's not Little Red, but she's definitely like that. I think Michael Tager, my managing editor, described her as Little Red's older cousin who teaches her to smoke cigarettes.
I love that.
She, those stories have different versions where sometimes sometimes Little Red doesn't survive.
Yeah.
And also sometimes Little Red escapes of her own volition. There's no huntsman. Sometimes she sneaks out. Sometimes the wolf in a lot of the versions, the wolf makes her eat parts of her own grandmother as a trick.
I had never heard that before encountering this text.
Yeah, horrifying.
Wow.
And so I saw it as, we tell the same stories over and over again. Folktales are the perfect example of that, but we also live the same stories over and over again. So it made a lot of sense to put them together into this sort of modern, I hesitate to say fairy tale. There's not very much magic, I guess, except the dreams, but like a folk tale.
There's a mythic quality to it.
Yes, mythic is the word that I like to use.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. It's so interesting to hear you say that initially the wolf's voice was your voice. Because again, you were mentioning, and it's in the text, that Ashley speaks to us only in prose and the wolf in syllabic lines. How did that come to be? Like, which came first, the speaker or the form, when you were putting it together?
The speaker for Ashley definitely came first, and she had a couple of iterations. So for a while, I was doing her poems in numbered lists. I was modeling them after Sabrina Ora Marks. It was, I mean, it's in her book of, it's in Wild Milk, which is, she calls all prose, but it was published in Gulf Coast initially. And it's called Don't Just Do Something, Stand There. And I remember seeing this form and being like, I need to write in this form. And then that wasn't really working. And that's also sort of where the prose comes from, because it was like each sort of sentence, the way I was writing each sentence was sort of like a push. It was sort of like a of each like line. And then it becomes a little bit more harried once you're actually in the prose. And then my mother-in-law is a stenographer. Do you know what a stenographer is? Like a court reporter. And so I was editing, when I was visiting Kenny over the summer, he would he was working, I was not. He would do work with his father doing lawn care. And I would be home all day, just like hanging out while they were working. And so his mother-in-law was like, hey, you're like an editor. Could you look over these depositions for me that I did? Basically, you know, she has this fancy computer with like 12 keys or something, and she's, you know, pressing multiple keys at the same time, but not everything comes through. And so I was reading through these documents, and those have a really specific form too. They're like double spaced. Each line is numbered. And so I was doing that for a while, and then I just abandoned that altogether.
Yeah.
But part of the reason for this, because it felt like sort of transcripty, it felt sort of like, have you read The Handmaid's Tale? I know The Handmaid's Tale is a whole thing now, but but when we're just looking at the book, that last chapter in The Handmaid's Tale, you find out that everything you've just read is a transcript. And who the speaker is speaking to is not totally clear, except that she's speaking as a way to record. And I was sort of getting that sort of like the sort of feeling I was getting from Ashley, like she's not really talking to anybody. And she's also talking to everyone. And so for her, having that sort of prose where she's so controlled in every aspect of her life, that the prose is a place where she just like sort of vomits everything she's feeling. Whereas the wolf, his poems have, I think, pretty much always been in syllabics, where the wolf is trying everything he can to not be violent. And so his form is incredibly structured because it's a constraint. He's putting a constraint on himself to try to not fall apart. Wow. And if you look at the poems, if you are so dedicated to this book that you decide to count every syllable, you'll see that the parts where the lines start breaking are the places where he's like not doing as well. So like the dream poem is sort of in Fibonacci sequence, but it breaks like constantly. And that makes a lot of sense because he's talking about dreams. It's when he's like sort of allowing himself to be the most intimate with Ashley in his own mind. And then, you know, by the end, it's just like, there's that poem, Ashley, or the wolf knows your number at 2 a.m. And that poem has no syllabics. And this is also, this is technically a found poem. This is a poem that is made entirely of text messages that my ex-stepmother sent me at 2 a.m.
Oh, wow.
So every stanza break is a different text message that I got. Yeah. And I changed it. So when she was texting me, she was like saying that she needed her help to help me save my dad. And my dad's not dead, but I don't talk to him. And I also didn't really talk to her at this point. And I changed it to, you know, be just between 2 characters, not really 3 characters if you're looking at me, my stepmother, and my father. But yeah, so that's where the forms came from. They're very, very intentional.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it feels intentional in the text.
Cool.
Yeah. One of my next questions was about the like who is Ashley speaking to, because her first person prose feels so like confessional and intimate and like even crowded. I love the way that you talked about that. And in contrast, the Wolf's like directly addresses Ashley. We always know who he's talking to. And there's that sense of like invasiveness and possessiveness in that we always know who he's talking to. And I was going to ask like how you found those voices and how they came together and who Ashley's speaking to, and thinking about it as being a confession in the style of like a stenographer's transcript is so interesting.
Oh, thanks.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. So next question, the speaker herself enters the collection quite forcefully at the close. And it's a powerful turn inwards to end a collection that is initially so narrative. We have these two characters, we follow them, we have the office, we have like these spaces, we have the story of the parents. How did you come to this kind of fourth wall breaking moment of finality to end the collection?
So there's sort of two answers to this, and I feel like one makes me sound better than the other. So the first, I'll tell them to you chronologically. So initially, I was calling this manuscript A Human Like the Rest of Us, which is a line from that poem that I read last night, The Wolf Wonders If Ashley's Right, where he says, I'm not good at this, Ashley, I'm not good at being a human like the rest of us, which that line came from a Facebook post that I wrote about when gay marriage was being legalized in Britain at the same time that one of the royal babies was being born. It might have been Charlotte Diana. Charlotte Diana. Good name choice, by the way. I appreciate the sonic quality of it.
Absolutely.
And I remember going on CNN to try to find out about the gay marriage thing becoming legal because it's so exciting. And I'm not a straight person. I'm a pansexual person. So, you know, I'm stoked on this. And I go online and there was nothing about it on CNN's main page. But there were 4 separate links to things about this baby being born. And I remember posting, like, you know, who, like, that she will be a human like the rest of us. Like she, like, you know, here's this thing that could affect these people's literal ability to live in the world. And then like CNN's just like, a baby. And there's like a lot of reasons for that. And so anyway, so my manuscript that I was originally working on had 2 parts, which was called Ashley Sugarnotch and The Wolf and The Rest of Us. And then the whole thing was called A Human Like the Rest of Us.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
The second part was a little bit shorter, but just about as long as the first part. And it had a lot more poems. I also had I had more poems about Pennsylvania. I had a couple of poems about, I had another poem about Trisha's daughter that was like a companion piece to the Trisha poem. And yeah, there was another statement poem where like I weirdly like was talking about race a little bit, and my really dear friend Jeremy, who is Black and who we got into, he was also like, not, when we dated it was not good. And then, you know, but there was like a lot of stuff going on. Like it was a real moment of intersectionality where like the way that I was treating him, I didn't realize what I was doing was like ruffling up problems that he'd experienced because he's Black, but he also at the same time was treating me in a way that was really problematic because I am a woman. And we're still very good friends. The bridge is under the water. So, I mean, not for all of racism, but between us. And so there was like a bunch of stuff in there. And then when I started actually sending my book out, I was like, I don't really like these poems anymore. I'm just going to send it out as Ashley Sugarnotch and the Wolf. And I'm going to send it out with this entire other book called Brassica. And it's going to be 2 halves of a book. Because Ashley Sugarnotch and the Wolf is about, you know, what do we do with violence? And then Brassica is largely about forgiveness. So I saw them as going together. Mason Jar Press picks up the book. They're the best. I love them. They're my people. I can't believe that I found them. They're just so good. And they're like, we don't want to publish the Brassica part. And I was like, that's fine. There is a problem, which is that Ashley Sugarnotch is too short. And they're like, we know. And they were like, could you write more Ashley poems? And I was like, no, I cannot. That is done. There are all the poems there that can be there. And they were like, well, do you have anything else? And I said, well, actually I do. And so I sent them the poems that I did still like from the rest of us. And that's what became the coda. So this is what I mean when I say one of them makes me look better than the other. Like in some senses, I always did intend them to be there. But in the end, it was because the book was too short, a problem I have consistently. And so, so that's why they're there. In terms of like, why the turn? I think because I wanted to, so we have this sort of mythic world that both is and is not real, right?
Yeah.
And I wanted to pivot initially and then later, you know, the way that we pick the poems to like, these are real people in real places that are, these things are actually happening to. So I feel like I can get away with some stuff in the first half, in the main part of the book, because it's mythic, right? Because there are dreams, because there aren't real people. That I could not have done if I had just tried to write it as like a sort of like straight nonfiction book. Yeah. Because I didn't want to speak in the voices of these people I didn't know. And it becomes sort of unavoidable after a while. You're making assumptions about people. I have one poem called Falter Suite about, which is published, that was originally in The Rest of Us, but isn't in the book, about this boy in Harrisburg who died of neglect in an attic where he was locked with like a mattress. And he was 8, and I think he weighed 16 pounds when he died. That's how like emaciated he was. And I wrote, but there was like a lot of stuff going on. I really was thinking about empathy a lot. Like his parents had a lot of kids. They were medically complex kids. One of them was sort of like in a coma or non-responsive, and was just sort of in like a hospital bed all day. And the mother claimed that she didn't know that this kid was being treated because the parents basically split up the kids to care for them. And it just seemed like both an incredibly cruel and violent thing, and also something that maybe could have been avoided if there had been more resources available.
Yeah.
And so, wait, where was I going with this? So yeah, so those poems, I was thinking a lot about empathy, and there were real people. Oh, but with that poem specifically, it got hard to try to get into these people's heads when they were real people.
Yeah.
And I both wanted to be kind to them in the sense that I didn't know their story, but I also did not want to excuse anything they had done. And I think that poem turned out fine. But that's part of the reason why I felt like I needed both. I think you need both to both say like, hey, this is real. So like when you're being critical of it, you are being critical of real people that this has happened to, but also like this particular section, if you're being critical of it, know that like these aren't real people in that particular section, in this first section. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. And it's cool to hear about the story of these two sections that then in like a publishing kind of came together and were re-edited to create this new piece.
Which is also important to think about, just because like, you know, you should try to have the best sort of set of materials when you start to try to publish, but also know that like there's a reason that there are editors, right? And having a good editor like Ashley, Ashley Miller, my editor at Mason Jar, is incredible. She saw exactly what needed to be there, and the book was, you know, she organized it, right? The order of Ashley Sugarnotch and The Wolf is pretty much the same. I think from what I submitted, I think she changed a couple of things, but she was the one who really curated that last section. And I think that it would not be so good if I hadn't had such a good editor.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, my next question was going to be about your experience with Mason Jar Press. This Authors Corner project, we're working with local authors, we're working with small indie presses. How did you get into contact with them? And you've already said what a wonderful experience you've had, but if you want to like, you know, shout them out a little bit more.
I'll compliment them until I'm dead. So I had been sending out my book for a while, not very long, like 6 months. And it's hard with poetry because you are always going to lose money on a book of poetry unless you're a very famous person. I'm not a very famous person. And so I knew going into this that I was going to lose money because, prose writers, especially if they're not, if they're taking a more commercial route as opposed to a more indie route, they get something called an agent. And this agent seems to, now that seems to be a problem. That seems to be difficult to do. I don't want to downplay that. But once you have that agent seems to do a lot of work for you.
Yeah.
And when you're a poet, you're basically just paying money to presses to submit to contests or open reading periods or whatever, and then saying goodbye forever to that money. So my friend Will, who is I have a podcast called the Smug Buds, and Will's my co-host. He lives in Arizona. I've known him for like 12 years now, and I love him so much. He's very tall and smart and kind. He had said to me, hey, you should check out Mason Jar. I've submitted to them before. They're like really good at responding, etc. It was like a $5. I almost think of it as like a $5 cover charge is what it felt like.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, easy, perfect. It's like, I'm an adult with a real job. I can spend some money, I just don't want to spend like $30. And I want to support indie presses too. So I sent it in and they picked me and I was flabbergasted. I was sitting there reading this email in July, like on my phone, and my husband got a call the moment I finished reading the email. And then he was on the phone for 30 minutes and I couldn't tell him. But
irresponsible, awful. How dare you?
I am incredibly organized. I'm like the person that I'm not like incredibly organized where I have like a bunch of like color coded stuff, but I'm like the person that like schedules and knows where things are. And I'm very lucky that Kenny is also like that, so that I'm not like the burden carrier there, but like, at work and group projects, at school and group projects, I'm the person that is the responsible one, and it's exhausting. And the best thing about Mason Jar is that I was not the most organized person in the room. And I wish I could tell you, I would leave those meetings just beaming, because I was like, I don't have to do all of the work. Now, Mason Jar is a small deal. So I, there's not very many of them. They don't really have much of a budget. And so I did a lot of work too, but every piece of work I did, I felt like they reciprocated. They were really good at communicating with me. They're incredibly transparent, which you might even see if you look at their Twitter. Anytime they have a reading period, they will tell you what money they made, how many submissions they got, etc., all of that. And they just are really, they're the kind of press you want to work with. They're quick, they know what they're doing, they're transparent, and they really want to support their authors the best that they can. I would have had a whole book tour if there hadn't been this global hell pandemic. And that was partially a lot of my work, but also a lot of their work and knowing. I mean, that's how I found the Inner Loop, is they knew about the Inner Loop and they were able to connect me.
That's amazing. Well, we're so happy to have you. That brings us to time, actually, but I would love it if you could tell everyone where they can find your book and where they can find you on socials and the internet and in person, wherever.
So you can find me on Twitter at exclamate, EXCLAMATE _ on Instagram at just exclamate. You can get the book on Mason Jar Press's website, which is just masonjarpress.com. It used to be masonjarpress.xyz, and I'm very sad that they dropped that. And yeah, I mean, I think that's it.
That's excellent. And you can find us, The Inner Loop, here on our YouTube channel, on Instagram and Twitter at The Inner Loop Lit, and on Facebook at The Inner Loop. And it has been such a joy to talk to you today. Thank you so much.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Yes.